Provide emotional leadership, stability. James 1:8 says, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Being unstable is always frowned upon in Scripture. It's always frowned upon. And here the Bible connects it to being double-minded, or thinking in part about spiritual things and in part about worldly or fleshly things. Duplicitous, some might say, or in a manner hypocritical. You understand the idea of being double-minded, and that precipitates instability. So if I'm struggling with being unstable, what does that mean? That means somewhere along the way I'm letting myself be double-minded. So fathers need to show stability, to provide stability for their children. That's a spiritual thing that reflects in their emotional development. In 2 Kings 17:41, lamenting Israel's spiritual woes, he said, these nations feared the Lord and served their graven images, both their children and their children's children, as did their fathers, so do they unto this day. Your kids' stability in their conduct and in their choices hinges on the example that you set. And here he lamented these people that were spiritually unstable in the choices that they made. Why? Because that's what the generations before them did. Provide emotional leadership in the support you give to your wife. And when I say support, I'm engulfing a lot of things that includes the concept of emotional support. Consider Isaac and Rebekah here. It says in Genesis 26:8, it came to pass when he had been there a long time that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out at a window and saw, and behold, Isaac was sporting with Rebekah, his wife. Now he saw what they were doing, and he concluded, hey, wait, they're married. Now let's talk about this for a minute. Your kids need to see that you love each other and care about each other. I know the Bible teaches us to be discreet, and believe me, I would not want you to forget that. Be discreet. But be willing to show your children an affectionate home wherein you provide that level of emotional support for your wife. Now, this idea of affection and emotional support is as personal and as individual as the next person you talk to about it. For one person, it may be physical affection. For the next person, it may be more about the way you talk to them, or it may be about how much you help them, or some other gesture that shows emotional support and a desire to be there for somebody. But whatever it is that fits that role in your home for your wife, be that for her, do that for her, whether it makes you comfortable or not, whether it means something to you or not. It's not all about us, dads. It's about our families. And so let's provide that support that makes for an emotionally healthy relationship. In Colossians 3, verse 12 and 13, he expanded the application of this kind of emotional support in talking about saints' relationships with one another. Put on, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercy, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering, forbearing one another, and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. This passage talks to us about being kind and humble towards one another, forbearing one another's faults, being forgiving for one another. And you look at that and you say, well, but David, you said that's about Christians and how Christians interact with each other. That's right. What are we going to do? Draw a circle around our home and say inside this circle none of this happens? We know better than that. If we're to treat each other as Christians that way, then how much should I treat my Christian wife that way? To provide emotional stability and emotional support and emotional leadership. Well, I may not feel like being humble. Trust me, there's days I don't. I'm not going to stand up here and lie to you. And I know there may be days you don't feel like it. You want your kids to grow up going out doing only what they feel like? Let's get over ourselves and put some effort into it and be the man God has called us to be for our families. Emotional support for the children. In Proverbs 18 and verse 2, a fool has no delight in understanding, but in expressing his own heart. I'm talking about emotional support as it relates to listening to your kids. I'm not talking about letting them smart off at you. I'm not talking about letting them be disrespectful, because that's not right. I'm talking about when the chips are down and they need to talk, listen. And as parents, we get filled with enthusiasm for what we need to say. And sometimes we're so eager to say what we feel like we need to say that just as they're about ready to pour out their heart and show us what's going on in their little heads, we run all over them full of words that may or may not fit what they're really thinking about, because we didn't listen long enough to figure out what they were thinking about. So follow what this passage teaches, and every once in a while, disengage from instruction mode and just listen to them and let them talk. Because I'm going to tell you something. If you don't, somebody else will. And that may be some kid at school that has a whole different set of answers than Jesus does. Or that may be some authority figure in the community, or somebody else that they know that is not going to tell them things that are consistent with the will of God. So make a habit to stop and listen, and then teach. Romans 1 and verse 31, lamenting various moral disorders of humankind, he laments those that are without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful. Let's focus our attention on those that are without natural affection. The term that's translated as that English phrase basically just means unloving towards family. You read about it every day. It just seems like every 2 or 3 days I see another headline about parents that locked their kids in a cage and starved them, or some mother that left their child or infant somewhere unattended, or threw them in a garbage bin, or something like that. They neglected them. That is the epitome of being without natural affection. You know, lacking in natural affection is not always that extreme. We need to zero in on the kind of attention and affection that our children need for their emotional well-being, and we need to provide that affection for them. And that's just as individual as it is with the wife. Some kids are snugglers, and that's what they need, and some kids, need something different. They just need time together, or attention, or taking an interest in that ugly picture they just drew. Whatever it takes, whatever it is, just give them that attention. Show them that natural affection. Don't stomp on them or bite their head off because they interrupted you. Be glad they came to you. It's better than them going somewhere else. I'm thinking about a sister in the church that I studied with quite a long time ago. Broken relationship with the father. The father had abandoned the home when this person was very, very young, because there were way too much beer to drink and way too many women to chase for him to be interested in anything like family. And he was a piece of work. And at some point, there was a minimal level of reconnection with his children, and it was not pretty. He was neglectful to his daughter. He did not treat her right. He was not affectionate with her. He ignored her, etc., etc., etc. And then later on in life, he got very, very sick. And a lot of his family and close associates that, when the beer was flowing, looked like friends, turned out to be vapor in the breeze. And he was in the hospital all alone. Guess who went to see him? She sat by his bed. He thought he was dying. He was afraid. And he was lonely. And he was starting to look at his hole cards. He's starting to relive a lot of his mistakes and thinking about the way that he treated her. And he reached out for her, and she agreeably took his hand. And she sat there and held it as he went off to sleep. She called me later to tell me about this. She said, "David, I sat there and cried because I thought after all these years, you'll finally hold my hand." He never touched, he never loved on her, he never held her hand, he never did anything like that. He had other things to do. And he didn't appreciate the importance of those things until he wanted it. Now, you may have all kinds of mental images about that guy and how you feel about him about now. But let's just disengage from that fellow for a minute and realize that the story is not about him. It's about you and it's about me, Dad. Let's give our kids whatever it is that they need to have the emotional security of our love and affection. In Colossians 3:21, he said, "Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged." This warns fathers against extreme heavy-handedness. While we're trying to guide and correct and give them those high standards we talked about earlier, we have to balance that against the idea of making them feel discouraged and think that they can't ever get it right for Dad. You don't want them to automatically think that the sloppy, half-hearted job they did was great, but you also don't want them to automatically think that no matter how hard they try, Dad will never be happy. Those are both extremes that are not right. So on the one hand, we have high expectations, and on the other hand, we're careful to not break their spirit. You ever work with an animal that's had their spirit broke? Maybe some of you hadn't had the opportunity to have done that. Some of you that are older, maybe you've got some farming in your family history and you've been around an animal whose spirit was broken. A strong beast becomes weak and seemingly useless. Let's not do that to our kids. Let's correct and let's guide, but not break their spirits. Think about that, dads. Now, maybe you're wondering, well, preacher, did you get that right every time? I bet you didn't, and let me just solve that mystery for you. I made at times a big love lolly of it. I did. And at other times I got it right. Fathers are people, and mamas are people. But that's no excuse to throw up our hands and give it no effort. Just because I'm human and I'm not going to do it perfect doesn't mean I'm just going to unhook and walk off. I'm going to accept that in my humanness I won't always get it right, but when I failed, it wasn't going to be because that I wasn't there giving it the best effort I ignorantly knew how to give. And I know every person that's grown in this building can understand that. God asks no more of us. You give that to your kids and you'll give them enough to give them a chance. You think about the foundations of fatherhood and the obligation that we have as men in our families. And then think about God. Who could be a more perfect father than God? Have any of his children ever disappointed him? Have any of his children ever strayed from his instructions? Was it his fault? Wasn't because he hadn't tried. Think about that. He's done everything a father could reasonably do to garner our loyalty and call us to follow him and do what he teaches us. But we're free moral agents and the rest is up to us. He's not going to grab our puppet strings and make us do the right thing. He wants us to choose. And I wonder what you'll choose tonight. If you're not a Christian, I hope you'll choose the best father there ever was, our Father in heaven. I hope you'll choose to obey the gospel and follow his call. If you are a Christian but you're failing him, I hope you'll realize how much you've disappointed your Father in heaven. and do something about it.